There's a particular kind of anxiety that doesn't announce itself loudly. It hides behind productivity, behind the next goal, behind the belief that if you just work harder, plan better, try more, you'll finally catch up. But catch up to what? Maybe you're scrolling through social media and seeing engagement announcements, promotions, home purchases, growing families. And you're still here, in the same place, with the same struggles, watching everyone else's highlight reel while you're stuck in what feels like an endless loop of starting over. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe it's you, that person who carries a specific kind of weight all year long, but it becomes impossible to ignore when everyone else is celebrating fresh starts and new beginnings. When the world is full of optimism about transformation, and all you can feel is the growing gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be by now. There's a loneliness in feeling like everyone else figured out some fundamental instruction manual that you never received. Like they're all progressing along a clear path while you're stuck at the same mile marker you've been standing at for years. Not because you're not trying, but because despite trying, despite wanting desperately for things to be different, the gap between where you are and where you think you should be keeps widening with every year that passes, with every milestone that arrives, with every reset of the calendar that forces you to confront how little has actually changed. Most people think feeling behind is about not working hard enough, not wanting success badly enough, lacking discipline or commitment. But psychology tells a far more complex and painful story. For most people who feel chronically behind, the problem isn't effort or desire. It's about a fundamental miscalculation between the life they were taught to expect and the life they're actually living, combined with cultural messages about timelines and achievement that make normal human pace feel like personal failure. The anxiety doesn't come from not caring. It comes from caring so much that stagnation feels like evidence of fundamental deficiency. The shame isn't about laziness. It's about watching the future you planned for yourself remain perpetually out of reach, while the present you're actually living feels like a waiting room you've been stuck in for far too long. Here's the part that makes naturally optimistic people uncomfortable. People who feel behind aren't lacking goals or drive or desire for their lives to be different. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the people who feel most behind are the ones working hardest. The ones with more goals than they can reasonably pursue, more awareness of where they're falling short than is psychologically healthy, more comparison data than any human was designed to process. They're not lazy. They're exhausted from running a race where the finish line keeps moving further away. They tried believing in fresh starts for as long as they could. They set ambitious resolutions, made detailed plans, promised themselves that this time would be different. This year, they'd finally make the changes that would close the gap between current reality and desired future. And every single time, despite genuine effort, despite real intention, despite hours spent planning and promising and hoping, the year unfolded in ways that didn't match the vision. The goals stayed partially completed or abandoned entirely. The person they were trying to become remained frustratingly out of reach. And at certain moments, that feeling intensifies. When birthdays arrive, when anniversaries pass, when another cycle completes and you realise you're setting the same goals you've been setting for years because you still haven't achieved them. When the calendar turns and everyone around you is celebrating fresh starts, but all you can feel is the weight of another year passing without the transformation you keep promising yourself. The psychology around this is more complex than it appears, because arbitrary markers create expectations that weren't there the day before. A birthday, an anniversary, the turning of a calendar. These moments don't actually change capability. They don't create readiness that wasn't there yesterday. But they create pressure. The belief that some external milestone should automatically catalyze internal transformation sets people up for exactly the kind of failure that makes them feel behind. Because real change requires more than a temporal marker. It requires readiness, support, realistic expectations about setbacks, and, most importantly, self-compassion when progress is slower than hoped for. Psychologists call this the fresh start effect, the human tendency to use temporal landmarks as motivation for change. And while it can be useful for some people, for others it becomes a recurring source of shame, because the fresh start never quite materializes. The motivation fades, the old patterns return, and then comes the conclusion that something must be wrong with you. What if feeling behind isn't about failure? What if it's about measuring yourself against standards that were never realistic to begin with? The people who feel most behind are often the ones holding themselves to the harshest standards. They're not comparing their reality to what's reasonable. They're comparing it to an idealized timeline, one that may never have been realistic in the first place. And that timeline wasn't set by them in isolation. It was absorbed from culture, from family expectations, from social media highlight reels, from the carefully curated success narratives that make normal struggling invisible. So they're measuring their messy, real life against other people's polished public presentations and concluding they're uniquely failing, when actually they're just uniquely honest about what struggle looks like. The crisis around feeling behind often comes not after one disappointing cycle, but after accumulated time. After another reset where you're setting basically the same goals you set last time because you still haven't achieved them. After another milestone, reflecting on time that didn't transform you the way you hoped it would. After realizing that the future you've been planning for keeps receding further into distance, while the present you're living stays frustratingly stagnant. That realization isn't motivating, it's devastating, because it means confronting the possibility that the life you've been waiting to start might never start. That the person you've been planning to become might not be accessible. That the gap between current reality and desired future might be permanent rather than temporary. And grief around unlived futures changes everything. Research shows that people experiencing chronic goal failure often develop protective pessimism. They stop setting ambitious goals entirely. Why? To avoid the pain of falling short. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Feeling behind creates lowered expectations. Lowered expectations reduce effort. Reduced effort confirms the belief that you're stuck. And temporal milestones become not celebrations, but painful reminders of another cycle passing, without the transformation you keep promising yourself. Another misunderstood aspect is this. People assume that feeling behind means not trying hard enough. In reality, it often means the opposite. It means wanting so desperately for your life to be different that every period without significant change feels like failure. It means trying repeatedly and having those attempts not translate into the results you're hoping for. It means caring so much about growth that stagnation becomes a source of genuine suffering. The person who stops setting goals hasn't given up on wanting better. They've given up on believing that wanting is enough to create better. And that's completely different psychology than not caring. This doesn't happen overnight. It starts early. As children, many adults who feel chronically behind absorbed certain messages. Maybe achievement came easily early on, and they never developed resilience for sustained, difficult effort. Maybe they were praised as gifted and learned their worth was tied to effortless success. Maybe they compared themselves to siblings or peers and concluded they were perpetually behind before they'd even started. Maybe they internalized family expectations about who they should become by certain ages. The specific memories often stay with them. The sibling who seemed to succeed effortlessly while they struggled. The parent who would sigh and say, "Why can't you be more like someone else?" The teacher who labelled them not working to potential. The friend group where everyone seemed to have life figured out by 25, while they were still floundering at 30. These aren't abstract influences. They're visceral moments that shaped how the brain understands what normal progress should look like. And once that template is set, it becomes the lens through which all future experience gets interpreted. When you're 40 and childless, you're not just experiencing your actual life. You're experiencing it through the filter of a 15-year-old who absorbed the message that everyone has kids by 30. When you're living with roommates at 35, you're not just in your actual living situation, you're in it while hearing the voice of a parent who said, "By your age, I owned a home." The past doesn't just inform the present, it distorts it, and the distortion is so complete that it feels like objective reality rather than inherited expectation. As adults, they're carrying those early frameworks while trying to navigate lives that don't match the templates they absorbed. The timelines they're measuring against weren't set by their current selves making realistic assessments. They were set by younger selves who didn't understand how life actually unfolds, or by external voices whose standards may not fit their actual circumstances, capacities, or desires. And recognizing that doesn't automatically dissolve the feeling of being behind. Understanding that your timeline is arbitrary doesn't make the gap between where you are and where you think you should be feel less real. What was once internalized as, "this is what success looks like," becomes a permanent measuring stick. It creates suffering regardless of whether it was ever appropriate. That recognition is important. But it doesn't resolve the practical problem of watching time pass while feeling like you've made no meaningful progress. And that creates an impossible emotional situation. You understand intellectually that the standards you're failing to meet might be unreasonable, but emotionally, the gap still feels like evidence that something is wrong with you. From a psychological standpoint, this is called cognitive dissonance, the tension between what you know intellectually and what you feel emotionally. Your rational mind says, "These expectations are arbitrary." Your emotional mind says, "But everyone else is meeting them." And the emotional mind usually wins, because feelings don't respond to logic. They respond to patterns, to deeply ingrained beliefs about what constitutes a life well lived. And those beliefs were formed long before you had the capacity to question them. Here's something rarely acknowledged. People who feel chronically behind often have rich inner lives and complex reasons for their apparent stagnation. Maybe they're dealing with mental health challenges that make functioning hard enough without adding ambitious growth goals. Maybe they're caring for others in ways that consume the energy peers are putting toward career advancement. Maybe they're processing trauma or grief or learning fundamental skills that others learned earlier. Maybe they're navigating systemic barriers that make progress genuinely harder for them than for people with more privilege or access. Maybe they've chosen values that don't align with conventional markers of success, and they're feeling behind according to metrics they don't even believe in. The reasons for not progressing along expected timelines are often legitimate and sympathetic. But the shame doesn't care about reasons. It just keeps comparing actual position to expected position and declaring you deficient. We live in a world that worships achievement, that measures worth by productivity, that treats rest as laziness and struggling as personal failure. Your ancestors had maybe one or two clear life paths to choose from. You have infinite options and infinite ways to feel like you're choosing wrong. The comparison isn't just to the people around you anymore. It's to everyone, everywhere, at all times. The internet has made everyone else's milestones visible, their successes documented, their timelines public. And your brain is running software designed for small communities where you could actually gauge what normal progress looked like. Now you're bombarded with curated highlight reels and wondering why your behind the scenes doesn't measure up. And those complexities don't disappear when someone finally starts to make peace with their pace. Because there's another layer. The loneliness. There's a particular shame in being the person who can't celebrate transitions the way others do. When everyone around you is excited about possibilities and you can only feel dread. When friends are setting ambitious goals and you're just hoping to make it through without falling further behind. Behind the stagnation is often hidden rage. Not at others, though sometimes it feels that way. At yourself, for not being different, for not wanting hard enough, for not changing fast enough. And behind the rage is grief, for the life you thought you'd be living by now, for the person you thought you'd become, for all the time that passed while you were just trying to survive. Most people don't talk about this part, the anger at yourself for disappointing yourself, the exhaustion of carrying both the reality of where you are and the weight of where you think you should be. Not failure, just the specific pain of consciousness, of being aware enough to notice the gap and powerless enough not to close it. Some people discover that releasing the timeline feels like failure initially, but eventually creates relief. That letting go of should be here by now allows presence with actually here right now. Some people restructure their entire understanding of success, shifting from milestone-based to value-based, from achievement-focused to process-focused. Some people finally address underlying issues, getting treatment for ADHD or depression or trauma that was creating the stagnation they kept blaming themselves for. Some people just accept that their path doesn't look like other people's paths, and that's okay. That behind is only meaningful if you believe everyone should arrive at the same destinations at the same times. Not fixed exactly, but reframed. There's something that shifts when you stop asking, "Why am I so behind?" and start asking, "Who told me this is where I should be?" The first question has no good answer. It just creates more shame. The second question reveals something, that the timeline was never yours to begin with. Maybe the path you're on is exactly the one you needed. Not the one you wanted, not the one you planned, but the one that teaches what needed to be learned. Maybe falling behind someone else's schedule was the only way to discover your own. What if being behind isn't failure? What if it's just a different route to the same destination? Or a different destination entirely? One that might matter more than the one you were racing toward? The people who seem ahead aren't ahead. They're just on a different track. And you can't be behind on a journey that's yours alone. There's no timeline for becoming yourself. No deadline for figuring out your life. No age by which you need to have achieved some arbitrary set of milestones. You're not late, you're just on your way. From a psychological standpoint, this is called cognitive restructuring or self-compassionate reframing. The mind stops using external timelines as truth and starts honouring actual reality as valid. And interestingly, people who release the pressure to be on track often experience relief so profound it reveals how much suffering the comparison was creating. They're not more successful by conventional measures. They're just freed from constantly measuring themselves against standards that were creating shame without creating actual growth. But there is one part of feeling behind that can persist, even after intellectual reframing. The loneliness. Even when you've made peace with your own pace, even when you've released impossible standards, it can feel isolating to watch others celebrate milestones with optimism you can't access. The person who can't participate in fresh start optimism because they've learned that optimism just leads to inevitable disappointment. The person who feels grief when everyone else feels hope. That isolation is real, and it doesn't resolve just because you've done the internal work of releasing timelines. Because you're still living in a world that celebrates advancement, that asks, "What's next for you?" that treats staying still as evidence of something wrong. The psychology of people who feel chronically behind is not about lack of ambition. It's about the gap between life as imagined and life as lived. The gap between the timeline set by younger self or external expectation and the reality of how growth actually unfolds. The gap between wanting desperately to transform and discovering that transformation doesn't happen just because you decide it should. And perhaps the most important truth is this: most people who feel behind are measuring themselves against standards that were never realistic, timelines that were never appropriate, versions of success that were never actually aligned with their values or circumstances or capacity. They're not failing. They're just human, moving at human pace, dealing with human complexity, living real life instead of curated highlight reel. The behind is constructed. The shame is real, but the deficiency it's pointing to is not. Some people make peace with this slowly, not through one revelation, but through accumulated small shifts in perspective. They stop comparing their chapter 20 to someone else's chapter 40. They recognize that the people who seem to have it all figured out are just better at hiding their uncertainty. They learn that everyone is making it up as they go, that nobody actually knows what they're doing, that confidence is often just practice pretending. And in those moments of recognition, something loosens. The grip of should, the tyranny of supposed to, the belief that there's one right way and they're failing at it. It doesn't mean the feeling disappears entirely. There will still be moments when you see someone's announcement and feel the sharp sting of comparison. There will still be birthdays that feel more like grief markers than celebrations. There will still be nights when you lie in bed and wonder how everyone else figured out how to be an adult while you're still feeling like you're pretending. That's okay. That's not failure. That's being human. And recognizing that difference changes everything, not overnight, not at any milestone, but slowly, gradually, in ways that finally feel honest, not behind, just here, exactly where life has brought you, which is the only place anyone ever actually is, the only place anyone ever has been, the only place anyone ever will be. You're not late, you're not failing, you're not broken, you're human, moving at human pace, dealing with human complexity, living real life instead of the performance everyone else has learned to stage. And that's enough.